Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Marie Noe's husband never believed that she could have done what they said she had done. Arthur hadn't known why the crimes occurred, but he damn sure knew that Marie couldn't be responsible. He had not even suspected it. Later, when she said she was, he didn't believe it then either. But much, much later, Marie remembered the details of 4 of those crimes. The others, well, they remained kind of vague in Marie's memory, but yeah, she said she'd probably done those too. Which is astonishing and horrifying and unbearably sad all at the same time, because Marie Noe's crime was killing 8 of her 10 children, all before they reached the age of 2. The other 2 children she bore, well, she never had the chance to kill them. One was stillborn, and the other died a few days after birth in the hospital under medical care. The 8 that went home with Marie and Arthur sooner or later perished, making them, for most Americans who by then had read about the parents' awful experiences in the newspapers, the unluckiest and most pitied couple alive. For the few who knew the specifics of those babies' deaths, though, bad luck became increasingly less likely. But proof otherwise was elusive. It was true that none of the 8 had evidence of child abuse or neglect. The babies were, when seen alive in public, usually healthy, clean, well-dressed, and burbling along like babies do. They didn't have bruises or welts or cuts or broken bones. They appeared well-fed, and while a few were colicky, they were not especially troublesome infants. Though, of course, they did always seem to be showing up at the hospital. Trouble breathing, said their mother. High fever, maybe some vomiting, maybe loose bowels, maybe choking. Something, always something. But new mothers do that. They worry, fret over a little spit up. These babies, though, would die shortly after being sent home without a single doctor being able to pinpoint how or why. It wasn't like medical examiners and concerned pediatricians didn't try to get to the bottom of it, but baby murder was hard to pin on bereaved parents, even when it happened repeatedly. It was hard enough to mention. Pointing the finger at a mother who just lost a child, even asking her questions, seemed ruthless. Marie Noe's first baby died in 1949, her last in 1968. It would take 30 more years for the truth to come out. That is, until Marie Noe said yes, she had done it. Philadelphia Inquirer investigative reporter Barbara Laker interviewed Marie in 2009. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist remembered a lot about that encounter.
I don't think she understood herself why she did it, because she did it over and over and over. The thing that I think is fascinating sometimes is when someone does something horrible, and I believe she was tormented by it, but then why didn't she go to someone and say, I need help, or stop having kids, or something to help stop herself?
A lot of people, professional and otherwise, have asked those questions. Maybe she didn't know how to stop, or maybe she compartmentalized so well she couldn't acknowledge it to herself. Maybe she forgot. Whatever the case, what led her to eventually acknowledge what she had done was some good old-fashioned journalism. An investigative reporter with Philadelphia Magazine reopened the then 30-year-old series of cases of what had, at the time, been considered early examples of sudden infant death syndrome. Once that reporter turned his findings over to police, Marie confessed to doing some things, if not all the things, and eventually pleaded guilty. But the question that consumed most who heard about the story wasn't answered with a conviction. Even Marie wondered why. In the end, She wanted someone to finally explain it to her. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. I love Wild Grain because it's an easy but delicious way to tackle dinner on a weeknight when all I really want to do is veg out after a long day of work. Wild Grain is the first ever baked from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. Every item baked from frozen in 25 minutes or less with no thawing required. I love their apple pie bites, I love their fettuccine, and I love their ravioli. Now you can fully customize your Wild Grain box so you can get any combination of breads, pastas, and pastries you like. If you want a box of all bread, all pasta, or all pastries, you can have it. For a limited time, you can get $30 off the first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC to start your subscription. You heard me! Free croissants in every box and $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC. That's wildgrain.com/COTC, or you can use promo code COTC at checkout. Marie Liddy was born in 1928, the fifth baby of a shiftless, mostly absent father and an indigent, overwhelmed mother who had already had her tubes tied so no new babies would be brought into the world. Yet Marie came anyway, followed 2 years later by a brother. So maybe James Liddy hadn't been so absent after all. What he certainly was, though, was one half of a volatile couple who never figured out life or parenting, asking the system repeatedly to take his kids into foster homes or put them up for adoption with the help of Catholic charities because he and his wife just simply couldn't do it. Marie was often literally abandoned as a child. She spent her third birthday alone in an orphanage, soon to be retrieved by her haphazard, immature, and always unfit parents. Rinse and repeat. When she was 4, she was diagnosed with scarlet fever, an infection that can develop when children, usually between 5 and 15, get strep throat and all its bacterial badness gets worse. Marie developed a scalding temperature of 105, which put her in a coma. Hospitalized, Marie returned home after a 2-month stay. Her siblings would later say she was not the girl she had been before the scarlet fever hit. Now, they reported she withdrew into herself, talked less, and seemed to be slower mentally. Consulting my trusty friend the internet, I was ushered to a group called the Pandas Network that informed me that in 1 out of every 200 children, strep triggers an immune response that leads to brain inflammation, which triggers, in some, behavioral changes. More looking yielded recent findings that, post-strep, psychiatric disorders, particularly those dealing with emotions, can occur in those who have had the bacterial infection. Good to know now, but not understood in 1932 or even later, when Marie's childbearing years kicked in. Anyway, the Liddy family expanded once again when Marie was 12, and her oldest sister gave birth to an illegitimate daughter. To cover up the scandal, the baby was raised as if born to Marie's parents. This meant that, while her parents worked or drank or left, Marie's child-rearing began in earnest. Marie had only finished the 5th grade. She hadn't even learned by then to read or write. Antsy for something better, she took off with a much older neighbor guy to Florida when she was just 14, exchanging sex for the travel fare. She later came home exhibiting a lot of precocious promiscuity. At 19, Marie met a skinny and shy Arthur Noe at a dance club. They married in 1948, moving into his parents' home, with Arthur intent on teaching Marie her letters. They were also regulars at local tap rooms. They liked to dance. But Marie and Arthur's mother didn't get along. Arthur began his trudge toward a long life of alcoholism, and 20-year-old Marie felt she needed more attention than she was getting. So, well into the 8th month of her first pregnancy, she made up a story about being raped by a black man who had come into their home and attacked her. And despite her claims of struggling loudly with the rapist, her father-in-law was upstairs and slept through the commotion. In the book Cradle of Death, true crime author John Glatt told Marie Noe's story from the early years on. Of the rape, he wrote, quote, "No one in the neighborhood seriously believed Marie, who would subtly change her story many times over the coming years," end quote. Marie and Arthur's firstborn, Richard Allen, appeared healthy, if slightly jaundiced, at his birth in 1949. His father, beginning a tradition that he would come to relish, bought a small $100 life insurance policy for his son. People who knew the couple or who had attended the birth remarked upon how Marie lacked maternal instinct and experienced none of the typical maternal joy in her new baby. She seemed uncomfortable holding the child and complained that, he cried a lot. Doctors agreed to hold him for 2 weeks at the hospital where he had been born on the premise that he was colicky. They may have also noticed that Marie was in some kind of postpartum depression and wanted to give the new mother a little breathing room. Richard was barely 1 month old when his mother bathed him and put him to bed, while Arthur worked a late shift. When the baby awakened shortly thereafter and began to wail, his mother turned him on his back, pressed his face into his pillow until he stopped breathing. She covered him nicely and waited until Arthur found him later that night, dead. There was no autopsy, but someone felt reasonably certain that they knew what he had died of. His death certificate's cause of death read, quote, "congestive heart failure due to subacute endocarditis," end quote. Not exactly a leading cause of infant death then or now. The family collected a small amount in a life insurance payout. 2 weeks later, Arthur took Marie to the hospital as she had gone blind the night before, something that had been happening to her since she started menstruating. This is journalist Stephen Fried speaking on a cheesy episode of Investigation Discovery's Deadly Women.
They're, of course, very freaked out, and they're trying to figure out what's going on because they see there's no physical reason for her to be blind.
The doctors decided Marie's blindness was caused by emotional stress. They dubbed it hysterical blindness. It will probably come as no shock to you that this is an outmoded term. Former FBI profiler Candace DeLong.
She would really become blind and not be able to see. But it was psychologically induced, a psychosomatic reaction to stress.
Later that day, Marie regained her sight. Soon enough, the Noes were pregnant again, having decided that Richard's death was no one's fault and that children were absolutely in their future. In the fall of 1950, a healthy baby girl named Elizabeth Mary was born. Arthur took out a small insurance policy on his daughter that day. Caring for the newborn was difficult, though, as it would be for all of the children Marie would birth.
There were issues with vomiting, there were issues with underweight, there were issues with feeding. She had a hard time feeding her kids. She got very frustrated when they wouldn't eat.
3 months after Elizabeth was born, the Noes brought her to the hospital with a high fever which responded well to medication. 2 months later, she was found blue in her crib by one of her uncles. Emergency responders arrived, transported the baby to the hospital, where she was dead on arrival. Marie explained that she had given Elizabeth a bottle, but the baby had vomited up the milk, along with some blood. That was enough for the cause of death to be labeled bronchopneumonia by a medical examiner. As author Glatt wrote in his book, this would have required a microscopic examination of tissue, of which no evidence could be found. He also noted that the suffocation of a baby is extremely difficult to detect. The victims are so small and they leave no defensive wounds on their attackers. To suffocate them only requires that their airways are obstructed and they stop breathing. Baby number 3, Jacqueline Noe, arrived April 23, 1952, and died 10 days later. She had not made a return trip to the hospital during that time. The cause of death was determined to be the inhalation of vomit. A side note about Jacqueline's death is that the Noes did a kind of 1950s GoFundMe thing, going around their neighborhood collecting money for the baby's funeral. Some of the neighbors took serious umbrage at this, as the couple was seen in the local tap room having a good time when they weren't going door to door. Also being noticed was the rapid demise of the Noe's assortment of pets who seemed to have inordinately short lives, just like their babies. After Jacqueline's death, Marie began exhibiting more attention-getting behavior, including claiming that she was being stalked, and 9 months before the next baby arrived, she said again that she had been raped. She was found that time tied up with her husband's ties and stashed under their bed. In the meantime, she reportedly went to seek guidance from her priest.
She wanted to get her tubes tied. She was about to do it, and she went to see her priest, and her priest told her it would be a sin, so she didn't do it.
Baby number 4 was named Arthur Jr. He lived 5 full days in the spring of 1955. Number 5, Constance, was born in 1958 in a different hospital this time, as the Noes said they were hoping for a better outcome. The doctors at first did not know her history, but when told, did every test possible to confirm that the healthy-looking infant was indeed healthy. She died a month later, cause undetermined, presumed natural. This time, the cops came to ask a few questions, but they, like the doctors, came up with nothing. Which is not to say the doctors were appeased. They most certainly weren't. If one child's death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious. 5 is something else altogether. Even now, Marie's crimes still have an ability to shock the unshockable. The journalist Laker, who has reported on all manner of criminality up close in her job, explained,
There are certain stories I've done over my career that will never leave me, or certain people I've met that will always stay with me. And because of what she did and the horror of it, like, she's one of them.
By the way, I'm only halfway through her litany of murder, and what seems plain to me, and to you, I'll bet, is that Marie needed some serious help. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Hiya Health Products. Sometimes I daydream about being one of those moms whose kid eats, like, actual food. But every day I snap out of my reverie and worry nonstop about whether this 10-year-old is getting remotely enough vitamins and minerals, because there's just no way. Enter Hiya Health here. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And Hiya does that while being made with 0 sugar and 0 gummy junk. Yet my kid still likes how they taste, which is nothing short of a miracle. Hiya is pressed with a blend of 12 organic fruits and veggies, then supercharged with 15 essential vitamins and minerals, including vitamin D, B12, C, zinc, folate, and many others to help support immunity, energy, brain function, mood, concentration, teeth, bones, and more. Now, we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you must go to hiyahealth.com/COTC. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/COTC and get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. As word spread about Marie and Arthur Noe's repeated heartbreaking losses, most people assumed it was simply terrible luck befalling the couple. As Stephen Fried said,
I don't think there was any suspicion at all at that point that any of them had anything to do with this, that it was just what happened.
Now, child mortality rates in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s had vastly improved over the decades prior. At the turn of the century, some 22% of babies died before age 5. By 1960, that figure was down to just over 6%. But losing 5 out of 5 babies, well, that was a statistical anomaly. At the time, no one called it what we know today that it was, infanticide. It's not common, but it happened then, and still happens today, at a rate of about 1 in 7 of every 100,000 births in the United States. Some, and the numbers on this aren't really knowable, are the result of maternal postpartum psychosis, a dissociative state where the mother doesn't actually intend to harm her child, but does. Brooke Laufer, a clinical psychologist and frequent perinatal expert witness in criminal trials, works out of Evanston, Illinois. She never spoke to Marie Noe, but a close examination of what we do know about Marie is telling, she said. The low IQ, the possibility of some brain damage due to the scarlet fever, Laufer called cognitive deletes, common risk factors for postpartum psychosis. Marie's potential underlying issues suggested by the stories of her childhood indicate the possible presence of borderline personality disorder, bipolarism, hypersexuality, relational dysfunction. All of this could have fed into her incapacity to maneuver the mature demands of motherhood. The chance that she had experienced postpartum psychosis with one child, said Laufer, and that it was untreated, doubled the chance that it would happen again. But no one stepped in to get her care, as now, nobody wanted to acknowledge that babies could be killed by their mothers. Laufer again.
Largely, too, we want to ignore the idea that a mother could be bad, or that she could be anything but bonding and happy and attached to her child and wants the child to live. It's not in our consciousness to accept that there could be alternatives to that narrative.
6 decades of medical progress hasn't made much difference, said Laufer.
It's still very much unrecognized. Postpartum psychosis is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM manual, which is, the Bible of diagnosis. So insurance companies won't reimburse for it. I mean, that's really the bottom line.
But Marie, like some of the patients Laufer has seen or testified on behalf of, seemed to know that she had done something wrong. She waited for others to find her dead children. She told no one what she had done.
A lot of times there is an understanding of right and wrong. I mean, symptoms can wax and wane. And many, many times we see women who end their babies' lives and then put them in a dumpster or put them somewhere where they hide them. So that sense of concealment is there, which often leads prosecution to, point to this intentional crime. But a lot of times women are in a dissociated state and it isn't premeditated. It's not, like criminal activity where there's an intention to harm and then hide.
Plus, added Laufer, Marie was getting away with it. Why rock the boat? As if to head off the clamor over 5 dead babies, Marie's 6th baby, Letitia, was stillborn on August 24th, 1959. Her umbilical cord had become knotted in utero. Baby number 7, Mary Lee, a month premature, was kept at the hospital where she survived for over a month. Of course, by now, doctors and nurses and medical examiners shuddered every time the Noes showed up pregnant. They spoke among themselves, frightened for the babies they had seen come into the world so healthy, disgusted because they realized that when their babies were in the hospital, the Noes very seldom came to visit them, if at all. Charles Gallagher III, a former deputy district attorney in Philadelphia.
She always indicated that she either found the baby in the crib or the playpen. The bottom line in each of these deaths was it was an unexplained death.
There were doubts aplenty, but proof? Not so much. Mary Lee lived less than 7 months, arriving on Earth in June 1962 and exiting in January 1963. Now deemed the most bereaved couple in America in a Life magazine spread that year, the Noes appeared under a pseudonym. People's hearts bled. Almost every time a baby died, the Noes would move to get a fresh start, they said, and they'd collect a small sum from insurers. Once or twice, when police came by to sniff around, they would note that the Noes had some nice new things for a family that was as perennially strapped as they seemed to be. During the late 50s and early 60s, Marie Molly Valdez Dapina, herself a mother of eventually 11 children, had developed a burgeoning interest in unexplained infant death. Some of that interest, the doctor said, had to do with the fact that nobody else wanted to autopsy babies. Some of her interest had to do with Marie Noe. Dapina personally handled the death examinations of babies 5 through 10. As a doctor inside the city of Philadelphia's medical examiner's office, DePina began educating herself, slowly becoming the topic's first real expert. In the fall of 1963, DePina attended the first meeting of doctors and medical examiners who wanted to share knowledge and theory about something casually called crib death. A few years later, in 1969, that same group of interested physicians officially dubbed the condition Sudden Infant Death Syndrome, or SIDS. SIDS was defined specifically as, quote, the sudden and unexpected death of an apparently healthy infant, typically occurring between the ages of 3 weeks and 5 months, and of undetermined origin after careful postmortem studies, end quote. It's a diagnosis of exclusion. If it is nothing else, it is this. Though many theories of its cause would come and go in ensuing decades, including infantile sleep apnea or Munchausen by proxy, nothing has been proven. For Marie Noe, the diagnosis recognition was a bit of a lifeline, a plausible explanation of what was happening to her babies. In any case, public, medical, and law enforcement pressure on Marie eased a bit, providing her cover for what were her crimes. Arthur, meanwhile, told everyone that it must all be God's will, and each one a tragedy. Arthur said, quote, each time it happens, you die a little bit more, and you get a little bit older, end quote. And then, as was the pattern, he collected on Mary Lee's insurance policy, and Marie was pregnant again, having followed her priest's admonishment against birth control. Baby number 8, Teresa Noe, died in the hospital of congenital hemorrhagic diathesis, a disease that can be genetic and entails an inability for blood to form clots. If you've given birth, you might remember the doctor administering a vitamin K shot to your infant. That's been the recommendation since 1961 to avoid these clotting issues. But Teresa, while alive, had been under constant medical care the whole time, so there were no questions for Marie this time. Baby number 9, Catherine Ellen, was born in December 1964. This time, an insurance company rejected the Noe's application for life insurance for their newborn. She was seen once by the Noe's pediatrician when Marie reported that Kathy had almost choked on a plastic dry cleaning bag that she'd pulled into her crib from her parents' closet. The doctor lost his cool, confronting Marie, but he was unable to ruffle her outward sense of calm. Baby Kathy, on the other hand, came off as terrified by the presence of her parents, according to the nuns who took care of her. Kathy's father tried again to insure her, taking a different tack with a different company, and was successful. She died when she was 14 months old, having lasted the longest of any of the Noe babies. The party line now for the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office was to say it was undetermined, but they knew better. The Noe's last child, Arthur Joseph, was born via cesarean section. Marie's uterus ruptured during the procedure, requiring an immediate hysterectomy. The baby had one return trip to the hospital very early on, when Marie reported he'd turned blue. An emergency room doctor wrote in his case notes, possible attempted suffocation. Nevertheless, the child was returned to his parents, who found him dead when he was 5 months old. Newsweek magazine, which had done a story on the Noes in 1966 when Kathy died, returned to Philadelphia to talk to the Noes, illustrative of the heartbreak and prevalence of the national epidemic that was SIDS. To be clear, according to the Centers for Disease Control, the number of SIDS deaths has been dropping since 1980, when 153 babies died of unknown causes out of every 100,000 live births. Today, that is around 35 per 100,000, or about 2,500 babies a year, having decreased sharply in the 1990s after healthcare professionals made it known that babies should sleep on their backs and have no obstructions such as pillows and blankets near them to block their breathing. Of course, the experts also reiterated the dangers of smoking around newborns. To be sure, not every doctor in 1969 was on board with the assumption that all babies were subject to the horrible epidemic. Some doctors disagreed. Stuart Osh, MD, went out on a limb at the time to say, no, some of these babies were just being murdered. But Sid's researchers and the public largely condemned him. The Noes, meanwhile, figured adoption might be a good idea. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Rocket Money. I finally did it. I kept punting on signing up for Rocket Money because I thought maybe it'd be time-consuming, but it wasn't. It was a breeze, and it's changing the way I handle all these monthly subscriptions that I've signed up for over the years. Plus, it's helped me save like $500 in a rainy day fund that's growing as I speak. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that finds and cancels your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills. It lets me see all my subscriptions in one place, and if I spot something I'm ready to do without, I can cancel it with a tap. And one thing I've come to realize is that I have my subscriptions spread out over a bunch of different payment methods, so I really didn't grasp how much I was wasting until Rocket Money. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's features. Stop wasting money on things you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/COTC. That's rocketmoney.com/COTC. rocketmoney.com/COTC. The adoption talk for Marie and Arthur Noe had begun after Letitia had been stillborn, but was halted when Marie was pregnant again. Oddly, one of the adoption references the Noes put down on their Catholic Children's Bureau application that year was the medical examiner's office. Emmy Halbert Fillinger remembered telling Sister Michael May, the nun who called to check on Marie as a prospect as an adoptive parent, quote, either she deserves a baby more than anyone else in the world, or she'll kill it real quick, end quote. By now, the Noes story was well known in Philadelphia, and Joe McGillen, an investigator for the ME's office, was sure Marie was killing her children. The ME, convinced as well, put McGillen on the case full time. The Philadelphia Homicide Division agreed to join the investigation. Serious canvassing began. Police interviewed the Noes family and neighbors. The investigators heard a lot of gossip, mostly about Arthur's drinking, about Marie's alleged assaults, her affairs, her bouts of temporary blindness, about how the couple's babies appeared healthy to anyone who had ever seen them alive. The police detective and the ME's detective did not always see eye to eye during their collaboration. Never was that clearer than when their final reports were issued in 1968. Police Detective Joseph Schmidt wrote that the Noes were, quote, plain, simple people, end quote. He found Arthur talkative and Marie pleasant and of average intelligence. He found no evidence of foul play in the 8 deaths. Schmidt had not spoken to the medical examiners who had autopsied the babies. As Arthur Glatt noticed, the detective believed that would be a waste of time because the babies were already dead when those doctors saw them. McGillen had been around those doctors long enough to know what they thought. Dr. Joseph Spellman had even gone so far as to write letters to the city and state offices in charge of foster home placements, adoptions, and child protective services stating, quote, we have extensive files on the background of this family. We are not willing to declare with certainty that these children died natural deaths, end quote. As a result, no child was ever handed to the Noes for safekeeping. They lived out their lives childless for 30 years, the object of a great deal of benign pity. Sid's research plodded on. One man's theory that it ran in families gave comfort to those who believed in the Noes. Then, in 1994, a New Yorker named Juanita Hoyt confessed to suffocating all 5 of her babies between 1965 and 1971. A deal for a book, which would become The Death of Innocence, was struck. In it, the Noe case was mentioned, if barely. Stephen Fried, a journalist writing for Philadelphia Magazine, saw the brief mention and began asking around. In the April 1, 1998 issue, Fried's story, Cradle to Grave, woke up a lot of people. It had depended on the work and the memory and the copious note-keeping that ME investigator McGillen had done over the years. McGillen had charts and statements and a really good recall of what Marie had said and how she had looked when she said it. His copies of the files that had been created decades earlier by the police and the medical examiner's office had been destroyed by those offices when a basement had flooded. Medical records, huge in this case, were destroyed by the healthcare facilities as they are not required to keep them for more than 7 years. But McGillen had everything: witness statements, neighbors' thoughts, doctors' fears, autopsy findings, and medical information even after he retired in 1984 because he could not give up on those babies like so many others had. Freed had also spoken to the Death of Innocence authors Richard Fersman and Jamie Talon, who encouraged him to pursue a story about the Noes as their efforts to get Philadelphia authorities, especially the district attorney, to revisit the case had proven fruitless. So Freed did what journalists do. He found as many living witnesses as he could find, including Marie Valdez de Pina. The day after the Philadelphia Magazine story hit the newsstands, Sergeant Larry Notiff, accompanied by 2 detectives from the Special Investigations Unit of the Philadelphia Police Homicide Division, paid a visit to the Noes. Would the couple come to the station for a few questions? Once there, the couple was separated. Arthur offered little and wasn't even asked to sign any kind of formal statement. He said he would wait for Marie, whose visit with the office would take 11 hours. In that time, she told them she had killed her own children. It was the early ones she could most clearly bring to mind. Richard, Elizabeth, Jacqueline, those were 1, 2, and 3, and Constance, her 5th. She couldn't exactly recall the other murders, but she wouldn't say she didn't do them. She just said she couldn't remember what happened. She signed a statement just before dawn saying as much, asking in her own sad way a favor. She whispered, quote, "Don't tell my husband what I told yous," end quote. Then Arthur was allowed to take her home. Later, it wouldn't just be her lawyer who would find that odd. She had confessed to multiple murders, and yet she wasn't retained. A week later, the news of her confession broke, and Philadelphia, divided for decades as to what Marie had done or not done, knew she was indeed a baby killer. David Rudenstein, a particularly flamboyant pro bono lawyer for Marie, stood by to say the confession was illegally obtained. No lawyer had been with her, though she was offered one, and declined. It was her low mental capacity and her history of mental illness that precluded the use of her own words in court, he said. His protests didn't seem to land. For a while, Marie stayed in the news, but police said very little. They could not go to the district attorney with just her word. They needed to find tangible proof that what Marie said happened really happened. It had been 30 years since she committed her last murders, and while a lot of people who had interacted with Marie in the past, the nurses, the doctors, the medical examiners, had had a lot to say about Marie back in the day, they had to now be found, and they had to be alive, and they had to be willing to testify against her. The police eventually came for the almost 70-year-old Marie on August 5th, explaining that she was being charged with 8 counts of murder. She was unemotional, even after she was convicted. Her sentence, 20 years probation, 5 under house arrest. There is no statute of limitations on murder, maybe, as well, on oblique empathy. Marie Noe was not going to kill anyone else. She hadn't done so in the 30 years since her desire to have children died with the recognition that she couldn't give birth anymore and that no one would let her adopt. As part of her plea agreement, which a lot of people vehemently disagreed with, was her agreement to cooperate with a panel of eminent physicians who wanted to find out what made Marie tick. For whatever reason, the panel never convened, and Marie never found out what made her do what she had done. Arthur died at home in 2009 at age 88. The Philadelphia Inquirer's Barbara Laker described Marie in her later years.
She spoke kind of flat, and she seemed unemotional, and other times when you got close to talking about what she'd done or her children dying, her personality changed. She clearly didn't want to go there. She didn't want to remember it.
Though Laker would add,
other times you saw this coldness or this sickness in her.
Marie died in 2016, age 87, having spent her final months in a nursing home. To research this story, journalist and writer Amy Wilson read Cradle of Death, a book by John Glatt, a 2017 article by James Wright Jr. in the National Library of Medicine, a couple of journalist Stephen Fried's articles on the case, and Barbara Laker's piece, Killer of Babies Now Alone. She also interviewed Laker and clinical psychologist Brooke Lawfer. We also tapped When Mothers Turn to Murder, an episode of Investigation Discovery's Deadly Women. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.